Welcome, welcome to the Heads Together podcast. I'm your host, Jo Mokes, and thank you for joining me again this week. So I'm joined this week by a loyal friend of the show, Melina Cordero. Melina has been on the podcast before talking about her platform, P20. Melina is a diversity, equity and inclusion expert, and she's coming on the show this week to talk to me about her Women on Work project. I'm really fascinated by this, and Melina is so good at really breaking down data points and pairing them with stories. You're going to really love this conversation. Check out the show notes for this one because I've put a few links in which are going to be important ones for you to find out a little bit more about what Melina does and how you can be part of this ongoing Women on Work project. Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to the Heads Together podcast. I'm Jo Mokes, and I am obsessed with cutting through the noise when it comes to growing your business. Each week, via intimate coaching conversations and inspirational stories, I share what it really takes to get the results you want in a way that feels right to you. I am all about attracting higher ticket opportunities, building authentic relationships, and creating the abundant, full-fat version of your dream business. I mean, how many of us have beavered away creating a light version of what we really want? The thing is, I honestly believe when you're outstanding at what you do, there is no limit to what you can achieve. So, are you ready to put our heads together and make it happen? Let's go. Hey, Melina, hi. Welcome to Heads Together again. Loyal guest of the show.
Love it. Love to be here.
So good to have you back. Thank you. For anyone, I'm sure that no one has not already heard your episode, but should there be one or two people listening who haven't, can you tell us a bit about who you are and what you do, please?
I sure can. So I am Melina Cordero. I spent pretty much most of my career at this point living a very fast-paced, fast-rising career in commercial real estate, rose up really high, really young as a woman in a male-dominated space. And in 2021, sort of mid-pandemic, I left it all to shift my focus to something I felt really passionate about and had grown over the years, which was diversity, equity, inclusion, and leadership. So since then, the past 3 or 4 years, I have been working with organizations on how to actually, effectively, authentically create more inclusive environments through strategies, tools, and a lot of education. And I also have a perspective on DEI that is very, very linked to leadership. So I work with leaders and organizations on how we create more inclusive leaders, because I feel that the people and our leaders are very, very important pieces of the puzzle when it comes to creating better workplaces.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I know there's a few ways people work with you at the moment, aren't there? There are a few different things. And I know that one of the things that you have developed is the P20 platform, which for anyone who's interested, I would urge you to go back, listen to the first episode that we did with Melina, because there was lots in there about the P20 platform, which is just the most incredible resource for organizations that becomes their it can actually become their internal, like, intranet version, can't it, of a DEI platform? So it's phenomenal what you've built with that.
Yeah, P20 is technically an e-learning platform, right? But I describe it as the Netflix of DEI and leadership learning. And I developed it really as a response to what I saw not working with a lot of organizations, which was a recognition that we need to be training and equipping and learning about this DEI thing and leadership and management development. But using tools and teachings and workshops and approaches and technologies, honestly, that didn't really work, were very boring, were too long, were not really equipping, and people were walking away feeling like, okay, I just spent 3 hours doing this thing, but now what?
Just the whole tick box thing.
It's a tick box thing. And sometimes box ticking is done with good intentions, surprisingly. And so what I wanted to do is marry good intentions with actually effective, useful tools. And so P20 is my response to that. So it's like a Netflix. So multimedia, short videos built on something called micro learning. So everything's really under 5 or 10 minutes with lots of resources from audio to video to written that focuses on really practical things, everything from what's a gender pronoun to what can I do as a leader if I have a hybrid team and I'm struggling to keep them on task, right? So really content and learning built for a post-2020 workplace, which is where the P20 term comes from, post-2020. And all of the joys of technology and hybrid work and post-pandemic reality that come with it.
Absolutely, because it's a different landscape now. It is completely different landscape now. So I just love that you've run with that and actually brought in, and it truly is, by the way, Netflix of DEI. It's so good. The way that you've structured it, so consumable. So yeah, kudos to you for that. It's amazing. I wanted to ask you, because obviously your own experience in this very male dominated real estate background that you rose up through. Well, obviously it was challenging, because I think it always is challenging as a woman rising up through a male dominated arena. And I know that that experience has informed your work. And I know that, because one of the big pieces that you cover with P20, for example, is gender equality. But I also know that there is a project, and this is what I would love us to talk about on this episode. And I'm excited to hear more about, because we've kind of touched on it when we've talked before, but I've never really asked you about what it was really about and what the intention, etc. was. So I would love to know. It's called the Women on Work Project, right? And I'd love to know what it is and what made you start it.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite projects and one of the first projects that I started when I left my corporate job, my corporate career. And the Women on Work project was started because I had my experience as a woman in the workplace in a male dominated environment, industry, company, Zoom calls, everything. And I don't think that I realized how many obstacles and challenges I was dealing with on a day-to-day basis because of that for years. And it wasn't until after I left and really towards the end of my time there during the pandemic when it hit me, oh my goodness, a lot of my struggles and challenges are related to this thing called gender bias, gender inequity, gender inequality, right? I was so focused on my career and growth and doing things well and getting the job done that I didn't realize how much of my stress and exhaustion was coming from these structural obstacles that were around me. And I started to notice during the pandemic how many women around me were struggling. Everybody was struggling, but there was something about the women around me who were struggling more than the men for lots of reasons. And when I say this, I'm talking about clients, I'm talking about colleagues, I'm talking about friends. And I started really noticing that distinction. And that was the sort of straw that broke the camel's back for me in terms of saying, there's some work to do here and I want to do it. That was the inspiration for it. And so when I realized that there were these structural things going on, that it wasn't just me.
Yeah, this isn't just a me thing.
It's not just a me thing. There's something to unpack here. I wanted to unpack it. And for me, I have a very data-driven, very research-driven background and mind. And I'm one person. So there's no way that I can say, okay, well, because I experience X, Y, and Z, we're going to draw this conclusion about the experience of women in the workplace. So what I wanted to do was talk to as many women as I could and gather their experiences and paint a bigger, more nuanced picture. So I wanted to speak to as many women as possible from different backgrounds, caregivers, mothers, single, married, no children. Also is really important to gather experiences of women in different sectors, nonprofit, private, public. Could we see a big difference between the environments where we work? I also wanted to talk to women with very different racial and ethnic identities, because we know from the data that the experience of someone with lighter skin and someone with darker skin can be very, very different. And so I wanted to understand all of that. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to just open my Zoom doors to any woman who is open and willing to talk to me about their experience in their workplace, so that I can better understand not only what the challenges are, but also what the opportunities are, and then take all this information and say, this is what we can do about it to make the workplace better for women. And when we can make the workplace better for women, we make the workplace better for everyone.
Absolutely. The first thing that's coming up for me as you're telling me this is that, my God, you are so the woman to do this, because you are, well, you just are. I mean, for one thing, you're so accessible and you make people feel comfortable and relaxed. And I think you must have been able to gather so much great data. Also, you are just a data queen, because you have this ability, don't you, to gather data and then really pull from it the key insights.
Well, here's what I've learned about data. I was just having a conversation with a client about this yesterday. Data is incredibly important. I love data. People love data. Every time I do a presentation on a stage, I always include data, and people are taking out their phones and taking pictures because it's useful and it sticks. But here's the other thing that we can't do without the data, or that makes the data even more powerful, is stories. So sometimes stories fill the gaps that data misses. Sometimes stories make data make sense. And stories, most importantly, humanize data. So sometimes we can talk about a data point related to, let's say, interruptions. Women are interrupted X percentage more frequently than men. That's a data point. What makes that data point really real and powerful is when you hear the story of a woman, let's say me or any other woman, saying, here's an example of a time I was interrupted. Here's how it made me feel. And here's what I did about it, or here's what I didn't do about it and why. And here's how I couldn't sleep that night because it just bothered me so much and I felt so undermined. So when you pair data and stories, you have this incredibly powerful knowledge and insight. And that's what I wanted to do here, because I didn't want to just keep going on stage and talking about data points. I wanted to make it real and human, because people can understand that, and stories stick.
Stories stick. Absolutely. We know that. And I suppose that's what I was getting at when I was saying that because you are so easy for someone to be able to share stories with, and coupling that with your amazing talent for processing the data and really pulling the insights from it, you were just the prime person to do this. So I'm interested then. So what were some of the key themes that you covered with the project?
There were so many, right? And every woman has her own story, but there are a lot of overlaps and a lot of shared experiences. And one of the things that ended up coming out, one of the purposes, right, that ended up coming out of this project that I didn't anticipate, was with each one of these women talking to her and reassuring her, you're not alone in this. I just spoke to 5 other women who literally said the same thing, who shared a very similar experience. And the look of surprise and then the sense of relief that I would see over the Zoom with a woman when I was telling her, oh yeah, every single woman I've spoken to has said the exact same thing or something, some variation of it, is incredibly powerful, because so many women, and really anyone who's underrepresented in a workplace, a lot of times we're sort of struggling on our own. Sure, we may have family or friends outside of work that we can rely on, but there's always this barrier because no one really fully understands. And so we're struggling through this a lot of times, feeling like, oh, it's just me who feels this way. I lack confidence or I lack assertiveness, right? And then we blame ourselves because we don't know that it's systemic or structural, in what ways, our feeling or our stress is triggered by the people or the things around us, as opposed to my inability to handle stress, right? That's oftentimes what we hear. So it was really interesting to pull out the common themes, and there were many, but there were a few that I think are actionable.
And that's what I'm interested in, because this project, like you say, just coming back to the why you did it, is that you could see that there were certain things that if you went into and really understood, then you would know where the changes needed to be made.
Yeah.
I suppose, the project will be interesting across the board, but what's the actionable stuff that's come out of this?
Let me share the sort of 3 or 4 key themes that really came out, and then what I think our response is, could be, should be.
Perfect.
And it's interesting because all these points are backed up by data, as I found out. Either I knew before or I researched and found out later. But the stories are powerful. And so the first thing that really came out is that women are kind of doing more, right? So that's probably no surprise. We know statistically, especially for anybody who's a caregiver who may have children, for example, that even in a household where 2 parents are both working, the woman ends up doing a larger share of the housework. We know this from census data. This is a rock solid fact. But in the workplace, women are doing more. And so it's really interesting because this concept called non-promotable tasks, which is super interesting. Non-promotable tasks are tasks, duties, responsibilities, things we do at work that are not part of our job descriptions, that are not compensated. So we're not paid to do them. We're not paid extra to do them. And that often relate to things like workplace culture, going out and buying the birthday card for someone on the team.
I had that in my head then. Organizing the nights out, organizing lunch. Yeah, I just had that in my head.
Getting the birthday cake for the new team member for their birthday to recognize them. Serving on a committee, let's say a DEI committee, can be considered a non-promotable task if it is not explicitly recognized in your bonus or promotion or job criteria, anything like that. So what I found was that the women I spoke with, were disproportionately doing many more of these tasks and working more and working longer hours and doing more unpaid, unrecognized work than their male colleagues, which is backed up by data, right? But what's interesting is that they were sort of expected to do this. It wasn't seen as this additional thing they were doing because they cared or they were committed or they were really valuable or they were good at that. There is something called, actually, I don't even know if there's a specific term for it, but if you've heard of the expression office mom.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, Judy's the office mom. She always gets everyone cake.
Yes, I've heard of that so many times. I was always really like a letdown in getting of the cake task, so I was never the office mum.
There's nothing wrong with being the office mom, someone who cares about the culture, who's thinking about their people. It's a wonderful thing, but it's typically not compensated and it's not recognized as a productive, useful value add tool by the powers that be. So what happens is that in the workplace, because of our assumptions and biases that we all have, no matter what your gender identity, it's just sort of assumed that these things come more naturally to women, or that women want to do them, or that they're easier for women, that it's kind of second nature. But it's not. It's effort, it's thinking ahead, it's valuing culture and thinking about how something may make someone feel, how something may impact a team, culture and collaboration, which ultimately impacts productivity. So what was interesting is that women were disproportionately doing this more often, and that when they did it, they weren't really recognized for it in any way as it being value add. But if a man does it, let's say a man would volunteer to organize a lunch or a dinner, they were recognized for it because, again, with our assumptions and bias, it was seen as, wow, he's really stepping out of his comfort zone for this. He's really doing this thing. Wow. And he would be recognized for it. Irritating on the one hand and inequitable on the other.
It's
more
utterly inequitable. But I have a question just on that one, that I get this gut feel, and I don't know if the data backs this up, but I have this gut feel that it doesn't feel to me like it's a situation where only the men are thinking that way and the women are feeling resentful about being the ones who are doing getting the cards and everything. It's almost like I think women have been for so long in that role that I think some women feel it's just part of what they do or who they are.
It's a mixed bag because we have these expectations and we know they're expectations. Like you said, I disappointed people because I wasn't the office mom, right? And you're joking, but it's true. So there's certain expectations. And so what happens is you have some women who do it because they know it's important. And even if they know they're not going to be recognized for it, they know it's important to the people and they know it's important to the team dynamic and productivity and things like that. And so they do it and they may not be aware of it. And there are also a lot of other women, especially women, I would say, who are rising up or who are definitely of the younger generation because we have been learning about this, I guess, a little bit more aware, and it's sort of bigger topic of conversation, much more sensitive and aware to these requests. And so then we become aware when we're asked to take notes in a meeting, even though we're one of the senior folks in the room, or we're asked if we want to serve on this committee. And by ask, I mean voluntold, right? And so here's the dilemma. We may be aware that you're asking me because I'm a woman, you're placing additional burden on me that I'm not going to be recognized for and that my male colleagues are not, having to deal with.
Yeah.
But the issue is that it's not easy to say no. Now, you'll hear all the time phrases like, oh, well, women struggle to say no. Maybe, but here's the bigger thing. Women struggle to say no, not just because we are afraid of disappointing people, sometimes sure, but statistically, we know from the research that when a woman says no to something, it is interpreted very differently than when a man says no in the workplace. When a man says no to something because he says it's not a priority, or I really don't have the time and I really need to focus on XYZ, or that's not in my remit, generally, statistically speaking, they're considered good at setting boundaries, assertive, confident in their role and in themselves. When a woman says the exact same thing, and even maybe in the exact same tone, they're seen as uncooperative, not collaborative, not committed, and sometimes, aggressive or hostile. And so we have, whether we're aware of it or not, sort of internalized that. And so the fear and the struggle to say no is not just about not wanting to disappoint people, but it's a tangible knowledge that if and when we say no, we could be penalized for it, even though we don't want to do it or we don't have time or we see an issue with it.
As you're saying that, I can absolutely, I'm just being transported back to when I did work in commercial insurance for years and years. It's just taken me completely back there because it's so true. In my experience, it's so true. I can remember being labeled difficult for not just going with the flow and accepting everything that was being put on me. And you're absolutely right. That wasn't the experience of the men that I worked alongside. It's incredibly interesting.
And I want to add that what I'm saying here isn't that men are purposely giving us more work or treating us differently. Most of this is what we often call unconscious or implicit bias. We're not aware. And we as women oftentimes interpret another woman's no differently than a man's no. We have very similar biases because we've been raised, career-wise in the same environment as them.
Yeah. And that's the point, isn't it? That we've got it ingrained in us as well. This isn't something that's happening and we're really aware of it and men aren't. This is something where there's a blurred line, isn't there, where we're not always aware of it either.
Yeah.
So that was one of these key themes that came out of the project.
Yeah.
So I suppose my mind's going to well, how do you change that kind of thing? How do leaders make changes within their organizations so that kind of thing doesn't happen? It feels to me like turning a really big ship.
I don't think so.
It's about awareness, isn't it?
Super, super, super simple changes. So one is, look, education and learning is always going to be a big part of this. So there needs to be ongoing learning and awareness of the things that I just talked about. What does the research say? What does the data say? What's bias? And it's good to do unconscious bias workshops. It's really important, but try and get specific. Like maybe we do a session on gender bias in communication, for example. What are some of the most common forms of inequality or inequities that happen in meetings in the workplace, right? Let's get specific about these things so that we can start to recognize, because until we know what they are, we can't recognize them. And then once we recognize them, we can actually do something about them. So I do think that we need to, first step, always become more aware of these things. All of these things that I told you, the number of times I've spoken to men or women and said this thing about non-promotable task and mentioned something like organizing the lunch. The sort of light bulb goes off for men and women, any gender that I'm speaking with. And they go, oh my goodness, you're so right. I've had lots of male colleagues, clients say, that's a really interesting point. I had never thought about it. I just thought that Jane always liked organizing lunch. And so I just always left it to her. But wow, now I'm going to think about this a little more. Maybe I should do it next time, or I should delegate to a male member of the team instead of making Jane, who's a senior partner, do it all the time. Right.
Mm.
So awareness is one. And then the other thing is, I think our workplaces, no matter what your sector, are full of these quote unquote non-promotable tasks that are actually really important, but we don't recognize them as such. So I do think there's an opportunity here to be recognizing things like committee work or tasks or responsibilities that contribute to culture, right? Culture has become a really important word, a really important initiative in the workplace since 2020, right? Because how do we cultivate specific cultural values in a hybrid environment? And so let's start to put them on paper. Let's start to recognize them. Let's start to say, if you serve on a culture committee or a DEI committee, or you're running an ERG, an employee resource group within your organization, or you're helping organize XYZ event, let's make sure that we create a spot in our annual review that is additional tasks that you may be doing outside of your remit. Write all of those down. I, as your leader, as your boss, as your manager, I'm going to make sure I take those into account. So let's just start to place value on those things.
Simple, isn't it? That is a very simple action, but it takes someone like you to do this project and to actually bring this data to the top. Do you know, it's just going back to these non-promotable tasks. It's just reminded me of someone that I work with who is a guy who often would go and get the birthday card for the person and would just do it. But I remember that we would actually talk about that and say, oh, isn't Dave good? He went and got the card. And we would do it all. Isn't Dave good for doing that?
Yeah. So it's really similar. It's really funny. When I was growing up, both of my parents worked. My father had a more flexible work schedule. So he was a professor. My mother was a librarian. My mother had fixed hours. So she had to be, at her desk in the library. Whereas my father had more flexibility in terms of he only had certain hours of class and then he worked outside of that. But, he had a little bit more of a flexible schedule. And so oftentimes it was my dad who was taking us to the bus stop as children in the morning. And it was so interesting because oftentimes he was the only father who was at the bus stop. And all the other moms, and they were neighborhood moms. We all knew each other. We were friends. We're always talking about how wonderful my father was and how, oh my goodness, so present and all these things, right? And he is, and he was, and he is.
Of course.
A fantastic father, very present, all the things. But
no one would have said that about your mom.
Right. And by the way, my mom just didn't want to have anything to do with the bus stop. She's like, I don't have time for that, right?
Yeah. Right.
But my father was like, they put these like wings on him, right? And he was this saint because he did this thing that they were doing every single morning. But because they weren't used to seeing a dad at the bus stop, they thought he was this incredibly amazing person. And well, why aren't all of the moms too? Because they're doing the same thing. Right. And there's this underlying belief or assumption that women are just programmed for these things and men aren't. So when a man does it, they're really making an effort. And that's just not true. It's factually, scientifically, it's not true. We have been conditioned, trained to be more attuned to certain things like, is my kid cold? Is my kid, whatever it might be. But we're not biologically programmed. We've learned this is important.
Yeah, I mean, it's all learned from go back to when, I guess, men set the rules because they were bigger and stronger at one point.
Well, let me take this opportunity to highlight one moment, a book I just finished that talks specifically about this. So it's called, let's see if I can put it in it's called Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong, and the new research that's rewriting the story. So anyone who's interested in this idea of, what are the differences between men and women? Are we programmed certain ways, nurturers versus et cetera? This book is written by a scientist, a woman who does an incredible job of navigating the science and the data and saying, this is the truth. This is what's nature. This is what's nurture. And these are a lot of our assumptions around men and women that are inherently flawed. And so really, really eye-opening, lots of interesting information for anybody who's interested in diving into that topic a little more.
Oh, I'll put the link to that in the show notes. I love Melina does the best book recommendations. You need to look her up on YouTube. Your YouTube channel is brilliant for book recommendations. So I will also link to that in the show notes. So what else came from the project? What else stands out as something that action could be taken on quite simply,
Yeah, lots. So here's one that's come up a lot through the Women on Work project, but also through my work with clients. So with my clients, so organizations of all sizes, I do a practice called a culture audit, where I administer a survey that's very customized to the organization to understand the dynamics of culture, opportunities, obstacles. And then I also have one-on-one conversations. So it's almost an extension of my Women on Work conversations, but it includes all genders because I'm talking to everyone. So it helps me see the compare and contrast, what some of the female employees may be feeling versus everyone else. So one of the things that's come up, and the word microaggressions comes up a lot in terms of these small, sometimes people describe them as paper cuts that are oftentimes unnoticed or unintentional, but, weigh on us, build up over the course of the day.
Yeah.
That make us feel excluded. And there was one in particular that comes up a lot and that I realized I experienced a lot, which was around social and networking events, how much women are oftentimes excluded. Now, when you are the only X in a room or on a team, let's say in my case where I was the only woman on a team, I was acutely aware always when I walked into a room or was sitting on a call that I was the only woman. So there's this awareness that is actually quite burdensome. We get used to it. We try not to pay attention to it. We try and ignore it and just power through. But psychologically, cognitively, they have found that it does cause stress.
Yeah.
To be the only X in the room, right?
Yeah.
No matter how nice and welcoming and wonderful everyone else is, when you are the only of your whatever identity that might be, it's stressful. And so what I found that happened, I came from an industry that was very sales oriented and very much relationship dependent, relationship built. So we were talking about brokerage, closing deals, building relationship with clients over long term. And so a lot of the success in your role or on your team was related to the relationships you could build with other people. And those relationships happened through dinners, drinks, lunch, coffee dates, ski trips, client trips, inviting the clients and the wives, as they used to call them, to your ski home in wherever, right? What was happening is a lot of times because the sector, the company had been primarily male dominated, these were men that had always attended. And it became sort of a guy's thing, a friendly guy's thing. Now, what happened in my case is the guys would get together and go to their annual ski trip or their annual weekend, but I wouldn't get invited either because they assumed I didn't want to be there or they assumed, it was just between the guys. But what's happening here is that women are missing out on huge and very important networking opportunities. And also, I would say over the past couple of years, obviously there's been a rise in Me Too and things like that. And I do hear from a lot of men a fear of, if I come into town, I'm going to invite John out to a drink and talk shop and life and all these things. I'm not going to invite Melina because I don't want it to be interpreted wrong. Right? Or I don't want there to be any confusion or anything like that. So that's happening a lot. It's happening a lot and it's happening with clients. It's happening with colleagues. And it's really frustrating and concerning for women because we are being measured oftentimes harder than our male peers, but we're also getting fewer opportunities to build those client relationships, to network, to expand out. So that is something that was a clear challenge. And so the question is, well, what do we do about that? Do we tell the boys they can't go on boys' trips? Like, no boys only trips allowed. And my response to that is, in an ideal world, we would make everything inclusive, but I don't think that that's a practical, feasible thing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that it could generate resentment on the part of some of these people who have, let's say they tend to be all men and they've built these relationships and it's an important thing for them, right? If we tell them you can't do that anymore, they're going to start to associate gender equity with
them losing out or them losing something, having something taken away from them.
Yeah. So here again, just like the first thing we talked about around, the non-promotable task, I think there are two very simple solutions. Yeah. One is making sure that, let's say in the case of you have a team, you have colleagues, make sure that the male colleagues are aware that this is happening, because a lot of times they don't even realize. Make sure that they're aware that this is happening and this can affect your female colleagues professionally and personally, but really importantly here, professionally, and giving them fewer opportunities. So if you are invited to a trip or you do organize one yourself, can you advocate for your female colleagues and say, hey, we really should have Janet join this one. She's been working on the deal and she's great. She should definitely be here. Right. So can you advocate for that?
Mm-hmm.
And in the case that that's not an option, let's say it's not your trip to organize or there's very limited seating or whatever it might be, here's what you do instead. Because the core of it is that this tradition and this habit and this practice is essentially creating a situation like this where men have more networking and collaboration opportunities and which will lead to professional opportunities and their female colleagues because of this.
Right.
So what to do? Equity is about recognizing that gap and doing something to fill it. So my solution, and I worked on this with a client firm that was very male-dominated sector, and this was happening a lot, is you create networking opportunities for the women. You make an extra effort to create more connection, networking, relationship client opportunities for the women so that they're not equal, because equality would be everyone's doing the same thing, but it's more equitable because now we're creating these networking opportunities to fill the gap that they're not being invited to these things.
I love that. And also, one thing that I believe is that when we do that and we close up that gap, that's only the first stage anyway. That's the brilliant first step. But over time, I would love to believe that then eventually common sense comes in and says, hey, how come we're funding like these two things? Wouldn't it be much better if we merge these two things and all have the equal opportunities? And it will happen much more naturally if that interim step's been taken at first to just bridge that gap. So I really love that. And this isn't anything complicated, is it? It's not a huge ask.
And it's not a huge ask financially or time-wise, right? So to one particular client I was working on this with, it was, okay, how much are you spending on the ski trip for the guys? All right, well, can you put some money towards sponsoring all of your female employees get a chance to go to the industry female conference, like, women's conference, or you're sponsoring their membership in a women's industry association, or you are paying to have an annual dinner or a quarterly dinner that joins your senior female leaders with other female client leaders in the industry to promote networking, which is win-win for everyone because you are creating networking opportunities for your women and you're strengthening your relationship with clients. So I saw this happen a lot I was in retail real estate. So shopping center investors and retailers and all these things. Yeah. And the women were doing this. They were creating initiatives saying, okay, we have this major national industry conference happening. Let's get some of the women together the night before so we can gather, we can share, best practices, we can just connect and network. And that's happening. So how can you, if you're a company leader, how can you support that and maybe put some dollars towards it and say, hey, I know you're going to this conference. I want to give you some budget to organize, a networking function and invite whoever you think.
I mean, God, when we talk about it, to us, I don't know, it just seems so obvious. It's like, why why would that not be happening? But the reality is that it doesn't always happen. And the reality is that, this throwback boys trips and that kind of thing, it does still go on. And the awareness has to be raised across the board, doesn't it? To shine some light on it. Sometimes I think even just the raising of awareness about this will prompt people to take the obvious action anyway to redress it.
Yeah. And, to use your phrase, the reality is that everyone's really busy. We've been asked to adapt and change a lot over the past couple of years since the pandemic. It's not easy to just take some time and think creatively and differently about these things. And so that's where I come in. And that's where I want to be that creative thing, because I focus on this. I think about this all day long. I'm coming up with creative solutions. Let me help you, because it's not your specialty. You don't have time. And it's been a lot on leaders over the past couple of years, the amount of shape shifting. And so I want to be able to provide those sorts of creative, feasible solutions and take that burden off of them. So that's a lot of what I do.
I love that. And I believe that a lot of the clients that you work with, a lot of the organizations you work with, there's also this element of, there's fear of getting it wrong too. And I think when people bring someone like you in, it's so reassuring for them, because it's like they want and probably need, to a certain extent, that validation that they're not getting it wrong, because no one wants to try and solve a solution and just put something even more damaging in place, in its place, and we know that mistakes can happen in that arena.
Yeah.
So I think that's something else you bring. Am I right in thinking that this is something that you will go and talk to organizations about as well? Just, the outcomes from the Women's Project, because it is such interesting. I mean, we've only gone over a couple of the key points, but it's such an interesting topic. So if an organization wanted to hire you to come in and just talk to their people about this, is that possible?
Yeah. And there are two ways I do this outside of my sort of strategy and advisory work that I work on with clients in developing specific strategies and policies and practices that fit within their organization and mission. But there are two ways that I've taken this knowledge and learning from this project, Women on Work, to make it actually useful for organizations. So one is I regularly speak on this. So whether it's to women's groups, it's in company events, organizations that are looking for speakers to come in at internal or external or client events to talk about what's changing in leadership, what we can do better, what we can do differently. I'm doing that all the time now. And then the other way that I integrate this into my work with organizations is through workshops. So if I come in, I do a talk, I can plant some seeds, I can share some information. A workshop is a way to get a little bit more hands-on and a little bit more practical within coming up with specific tools. And so when I say workshop, I say things like, all of these discoveries I made through this project and identifying what a challenge is and then what the solutions are, the workshop is really about digging into the specifics of how to implement that and how to actually do something about it. So if it's an example of gender bias in communication, it's doing an assessment around what are our different communication styles and processing styles, and then how can some of those be interpreted as bias, and then how can we avoid that so that we create an environment where everyone feels that their voice is valued, however that comes out and however that may be.
So I can really see how this project has informed the work that you're doing now as well, because presumably some of these things that have come out, the two examples that we've looked at, the microaggressions and also this kind of non-promotable work, I guess that has really fed now these workshops. So if it's around that topic, you really know what you're looking for now in terms of assessing what's going on. What a great project to have carried out.
Yeah. And I want to mention that I started the project in 2021, where I felt we were at a really important inflection point, and I wanted to capture the experiences of how we were navigating that turning point and these transformations and going forward. And I want to emphasize that this is a project that is ongoing and open. And it's really important, I think, that we chart how these stories change or don't change over time. And so if anyone's listening to this and is really curious or interested in getting involved in the project, either as a woman who wants to share her story confidentially, or as a person who would like to maybe bring these insights to their team or organization or association. This is an open, ongoing project, and I definitely invite you. I have a page on my website specific to the Women on Work project, and you can go there, get more information either about participating as a woman sharing her experience or as someone who'd like to bring these learnings to their organization.
Perfect. So I'm going to put a link to the show notes to your website, which is melinacordero.com, right? And we'll put a link into that specific Women on Work page as well. And so also women listening who want to be involved, like you say, the best way for them to reach out is to go to that page and there'll be a way for them to register.
Yeah, absolutely. Literally on the page is everything about the project, why I'm doing it, how it works, confidentiality, privacy, the kinds of questions I ask. And then there's a link to go ahead and schedule a session, or you can email me if you have a couple questions before you commit.
It's such important work. And I love that this is an ongoing project, because it wouldn't make sense for it not to be, would it? We're definitely not there yet. So this has to be an ongoing project.
No, and I say this all the time with leadership and DEI. The learning never ends.
Right.
You can be an expert in DEI. I am a practitioner. I do this day in, day out. I will never stop learning. Every day I'm reading new research, articles, new perspectives, new books. This is ongoing. And so I want to take that burden off of everyone of thinking I need to be an expert in this, or I need to get to X point in order to be equitable. No, this is ongoing. It's ongoing. It's always learning. It's always not knowing answers to things. There are tons of things I don't know the answer to. And my job is learning as much as I can every single day to be able to help people do and be better.
Wow. What a lovely way to end this conversation. Oh, Melina, thank you so much. I think this is such an interesting topic, and I know everyone listening is going to be interested in this. And I think a lot of our listeners are either having their own business, but have had that corporate experience. So it's going to really resonate with them. So I know for me, this has been so interesting because I feel like I've been transported back 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which feels like a lifetime ago now.
Yeah. And by the way, the women I spoke to were at all different levels and all different kinds of organizations. So I spoke to women who work in the government, the federal government. I spoke to women who work in private companies, large and small. I spoke to women who work at very mission-driven nonprofits. And here's what I'll say. There's an incredible amount of commonality and common challenges across all types and sizes of organization. There's oftentimes this misconception that if it's in the government or if it's this, mission-driven nonprofit organization that things are better.
Yeah, I must admit, I kind of had that assumption.
No.
But no.
No, because we're talking about human biases. We're talking about human assumptions. And whether you work at a nonprofit or a big private company, you're not more or less human than each other, right? And so we're all hindered by our human cognitive limitations and the limitations of our experiences. We all have them. And so it doesn't matter the context of the work. We're talking about human interactions. And that's where I play.
And I just want to also say that the solutions to this, as you're saying, and the kind of work you do to help organizations deal with this and make changes, they don't have to knock everything down in their business and start again. Often the solutions are pretty simple, but it's having someone like you to come in and really assess where they are and assess where they need to start in making change. It's such important work.
Little hinges swing big doors. That's my motto that drives a lot of my work with organizations. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. So true. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for making space to have these conversations and share these new ideas and projects and connect women with opportunities and collaboration.
Anything that affects women is a topic for this podcast. So I am more than happy to share that. And thank you so much. Bye for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that getting our heads together this week has filled your mind with what's possible. If you love the show, would you do me a massive favour, please? Would you leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts? It would really help me put more heads together, reach more ears and expand more minds. Until next week, bye for now.